Alright, so now I've got my tall 6-inch cake, my gold Wilton colour mix, a bag full of edible confettis, my piping gel, a paintbrush. Now to get started, we need to put some piping gel onto our cake. This will just act as the glue for the edible confettis to sit on. I've got a really small paintbrush for a really big cake, so if you do have a bigger paintbrush, please use it. You're gonna save yourself heaps of time. So you don't need too much, and just do this all around your cake. Okay, so I can feel that this is nice and tacky. So now we're ready to add our edible confettis. Now, this is when it actually starts to get a bit messy. So this is why I've put my cake inside a tray, just so that when I place my confettis onto my cake, any excess that fall off will land in the tray. It'll save you a good amount of time cleaning up afterwards. So I've now placed my confettis into the bowl, ready to scoop onto my cake. I actually don't know if you guys can see or not, but I actually have small 3mm confettis and then bigger 6mm confettis. I just want to create a bit more depth in my design, which is why I've decided to use 2 different sizes. Move the cake to the edge of the board and stick. Oh look, I've already created a mess. Jesus. Anyway, stick your confettis on. See how messy this is? And just continue to do this all around your cake. What I actually love about this technique is that this will hide any lumps and bumps on your fondant from when you've covered your cake. So your cake doesn't have to be perfect for this technique to work, which I think is especially awesome for beginners. So I'm actually really happy with the coverage I've got going on at the moment with my cake. So I'm just going to put this aside, clean up my area, because you guys should see my floor at the moment. And you know what? I actually love how this cake is at the moment. I kind of don't want to spray paint it gold, but that's not the tutorial I promised you. So we'll spray paint it gold, but I'm actually really loving this bright color at the moment. So I've cleaned up my area, and now it's time to spray paint this big guy. Now, for those of you who are working in the kitchen, I'd probably recommend putting this cake in a box just to protect this spray from going everywhere. But I don't have a box, so I'm just gonna roll with it. Hopefully I don't spray paint everything. You're joking. I've only used 1 whole can of these, and I didn't even make it through the first layer of my cake. Looks like it's time for plan B. So the spray paint failed. That really sucks. So what I'm gonna do is I'm actually going to use a Rolcom Super Gold and paint the cake myself using a paintbrush. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna empty a little bit into my bowl. Just about this much for now. It's all about getting the consistency right when you add in your alcohol. Now I'm just gonna add a little bit of vodka. It's always best to add a little bit less than it is to add a bit more. Put that in. Okay. I'm just gonna give it a bit of a stir. Awesome, so now I've got a nice paint ready to use. Now, of course, I'm gonna need a whole lot more of this to cover the cake, but just gonna start small for the moment, see how much coverage I get with just this. So what you wanna do is you actually wanna just keep dabbing. Don't paint strokes, because that's just gonna rip up all of the confetti that you've just glued on. Just get a load of paint on your paintbrush and just start dabbing. Because we have to actually be more involved with painting this cake, you will bring up a few of the confettis as you paint. Unfortunately, that's just how it's gonna go. Nothing you can do to prevent that. So I finally finished painting my cake. That probably took about an hour. and I use 3/4 of this container here. And then all you have to do is wait for this guy to dry, and it really doesn't take that long because of the alcohol dries up the paint very quickly. All right, so now it's time to move on to making our flower. So what people usually do when they make this type of design, especially with the gold sequins, is they usually have a beautiful dainty sugar flower with some greenery sitting on the side, and it looks stunning. But what I want to do is actually create not only a design that's elegant, but also something that's really quite impacting, something you'd probably find at a fashion runway event. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a beautiful and big and white wafer paper flower to sit on the side of this cake. So to begin with, we're going to create a base for our flower petals to sit on. So I'm just going to grab my white fondant and roll it out to roughly 3 mils thick. It doesn't have to be perfect at all because this is going to be the back of the flower. So you know, if the fondant has creases and stuff in it, no big deal. I'm using my 48 mil cutter, and I'm just going to set that aside to dry. Next, we're going to be creating our petals. So I actually have 2 templates here for my petals. I actually went to Google Images and just typed in paper petal templates, I think it was. So I downloaded the picture of images, I imported it into a Word document, and I resized the picture to fit the size of my flower that I wanted. So of course, the bigger your petals, the bigger the flower is obviously going to be. So on the flower that we're making today, we have 2 different size layers. Per layer, you want to make sure that you cut out an odd number of petals rather than an even amount. So we want 5 cut out of the bigger petal and 3 cut out of the smaller. So here I've got my wafer paper, and for those of you who don't know, there is always a back and a front to wafer paper. So this is the front. I don't know if you can see, but it's very smooth. You flip over to the back and it's actually got that bumpy texture to it. So to cut out your petals, all we're going to do, using our template, place it onto the back side of your wafer paper. Get a normal pencil and very lightly trace around your template. Now I don't know if you can see my faint outline at all. So using real pencil is usually a bit of a no-no when it comes to creating something completely edible. So what you're going to do when you cut this out is make sure you cut this out on the inside of your pencil line rather than the outside. It's also important that you cut on the inside so you actually don't see any of the pencil lines coming through when you piece your flower together. So what I'm going to do is I'm now going to cut this out. And now we have our first petal. What we now want to do is actually cut a center point into our petal, like so. Just like this. So you cut the center point just below halfway. What the center point does, it actually will allow us to fold the flower and glue it into place. And that's our first petal completely cut and done. So I've cut out all of my petals and we're actually going to start piecing our first layer. Remember to put in your splits, that's very important. So the glue we're going to use today, piping gel. If you use water or any type of sugar glue, you're going to have a bad time because the wafer paper will disintegrate. So piping gel is definitely the glue you have to use for this project. So what we're going to do, make sure all the first layer petals are turned so the backs are facing up. So bumpy side up. And what we're going to do is lightly coat our petals with our piping gel. So the areas that we want to coat our petals in is around the seam area of the petal. Apply a little bit of piping gel at the top of our petals. So brushing the piping gel at the top of these flowers will allow us to manipulate the wafer paper into a more natural position. And we're going to do that with each of our petals. Make sure when you do these petals as well, it's probably best to hold your wafer paper in place and use downwards brush strokes Otherwise, your wafer paper is just going to move and pucker like this. We want to avoid that. Alright, so I've finished brushing piping gel onto my petals, and now I've got hold of our petal base, which we did earlier. And I'm just going to brush piping gel onto this as well, just so the petals will glue onto the base properly. Again, you don't need too much. What we want to do is actually work from the front of the petal. So flip your petal over to the front, cross over your petals, like so, and glue down. So the more you cross over this middle point seam, the more your petals will actually cup. I don't know if you can see that properly. So there's no right or wrong way to do this. Usually the more inner layers are more cupped than the outer layers, but it all depends, there's no right or wrong. We're now able to manipulate the wafer paper into a more natural curve. So if you find when you start to bend your wafer paper edges that they're very rigid and they start breaking, that means that you haven't applied enough piping gel. So just lie your paper back down, apply more piping gel, and just let it set in for about 30 seconds before trying to manipulate it again. So there's no right or wrong way of doing this. I'm just going to fold my petal like so. And maybe I might do this side the other way. See how that just gives it that little bit of extra movement in the flower? I know it doesn't look like much, but when you actually start to piece this together, it's really going to start to make your flower look alive. We're now going to glue this onto our fondant base. So moving on to our next petal, turning it over, crossing it. So you want to make sure all the petals are crossed in a similar position, and manipulate the tops of the flowers. Now this is when it starts to get really fiddly, because it's quite hard to position your petals in the right position, but you're not quite sure how much space each petal is going to take up. It really is all about playing, and you'll find that you might be manipulating the flowers and moving the flowers around even towards the end of putting this flower together. Your hands will get sticky. Make sure you have a damp cloth beside you just to keep on wiping your hands. I'm going to continue putting this first layer on. Okay, so I finished the first layer of my flower, starting to look good, but I've realised I put a bit too much piping gel on. So I don't know if you can see, but see how these little indents are appearing in my wafer paper? That means I've oversaturated my wafer paper with piping gel, and it doesn't like it. So this is what happens when you put too much piping gel on, so just be aware, this is what's happened to me. Don't do the same thing. So now that I've learnt my lesson, I'm going to be careful when I put my next layer of petals on. So exactly like how we did our first layer, we're going to apply some piping gel. So again, mental note to myself, don't oversaturate your petals with piping gel. So I'm going to put a little bit less on than what I did earlier. Now look, if that happens to you, you've put too much piping gel on, don't fret. If you don't have enough wafer paper to redo your petals, the flower will still look stunning, trust me. And when you place it onto your cake, no one will be looking at those finer details like you do. They'll be taking in, the person looking at the cake will actually be taking in the whole design. They won't be nitpicking every little thing. We're just going to let that sit for just a few moments so the piping gel absorbs into the wafer paper. As I mentioned last time, usually the inner layers of the flowers are a little more cupped than the outer layers. Just going to fold it like so and start to manipulate the top of the petals. So I'm just going to add a little bit of piping gel onto the center of the flower, just so we have a place for our petals to stick onto. You want to start your petal in the middle of two joining petals, if that makes sense. So just to show you, see how I've started this petal in between this join? And because we only have 3 petals left, we just want to evenly space that on the inside of our flower. All right, so we've now finished placing the petals onto our flower, and it's really coming together. It looks fantastic. So now what we're going to do is we're actually going to create the center of our flower, just to cover up the seams from the petals that we've made. So to create the center of this flower, I'm just going to roll out some white fondant to roughly 5 mil thick. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to create a pattern into the fondant using this texture mat. So I'm just going to get a circle cutter, using some piping gel, place a little bit on the back of your center, just so that it's tacky and sticky, and gently press down into the middle of your flower. So set this flower aside for at least 3 hours so it has time to dry, but I'd recommend leaving it overnight so it is a bit more firm to use. All right, now comes to the exciting bit. We finally get to place our flower onto our cake. Now, just thought I'd show you, I actually made a flower in advance of this class. So this is the flower that we made in class today. And this is the flower I made probably about a week ago. I used exactly the same templates, but I've actually manipulated the flowers a bit differently. See how this flower sits a little bit flatter than this one here? So I've actually cupped the petals more. And really, when I play with the flowers on each cake, I actually prefer the more cupped image, but you yourself might prefer the more flatter flower. So now's the time to actually fiddle around with where you want to place your flower onto the cake. You could place the flower in the middle. I prefer to offset my flower just to give the design a bit more interest. So here is what the flower looks like offset, and I actually think it looks really good. So to glue the flower onto our cake, we first create a little wedge out of fondant. Now, the size doesn't really matter, just as long as it's big enough to support your big flower and small enough so that you can't see this wedge poking out from behind. So my flower is to be offset, so I'm going to glue the wedge right here using some sugar glue. I'm then going to place some sugar glue on this part of the wedge here because that's where our flower is going to be sitting on. So the angle of your wedge will determine how your flower sits. Now this is where it gets a bit fiddly. Position the flower and gently press into place. And there we have it, our beautiful finished gold sequin cake with our white large wafer paper flower. It's just such an elegant piece, and I hope you guys enjoyed making it with me. If you have any feedback, please comment below and click subscribe to keep up to date with all of my upcoming videos. Thank you guys for watching. Bye.